Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome back Shaykh Hamza Karamali. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Always a pleasure, Paul.
It's great to have you back, sir. Hamza is a traditionally trained theologian who specializes in arguments for the existence of God and the truth of Islam. He's the founder of Why Islam is True, which is an online resource, a textbook, and a teacher training program that has trained over 600 teachers in 19 different countries. His work is based on the Muslim scholarly tradition as taught in traditional seminaries all over the world, such as Al-Azhar in Egypt and Deoband in India. And he's now teaching the traditional Muslim rational sciences of logic, philosophy, and theology, all in engagement with modern science and philosophy at Kalam 3.0 Institute. Registration for the first year of the program is now open, and you can find out more by visiting whyislamistrue.com/Kalam in the link which is in the description box below. Now, in today's presentation, Hamza will explain what Kalam 3.0 is and how it can be used to de-Christianize William Lane Craig's famous Kalam cosmological argument, also known as the KCA for short. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm going to talk today about Kalam 3.0 and reclaiming the Kalam cosmological argument from William Lane Craig. I always thought it was rather strange that the main philosopher to make a Kalam argument, and Kalam is the name for traditional Muslim theology, I always thought it was very strange that it's a Christian. And I wondered for like decades, why aren't Muslims doing this? Why is the only person who's doing this a Christian? So I worked a little bit in Kalam myself, and I studied his work. It's very useful. His work is extremely useful because what he's done is he's charted a path for Muslim theologians to bring their argument into the philosophical mainstream. I think I know actually that he's made a couple of mistakes, but he's taken the first step, and he's given us direction in where to go. So what I'm going to show today is I'm going to talk about something called Kalam 3.0, which I'll tell you more about that in a second. And then I'm going to show you how we can use that to begin to take the Kalam cosmological argument back from William Lane Craig. So today's presentation, I'm going to do 5 things. The first thing is I'm going to talk about Kalam. What is Kalam anyway? And then I'm going to explain the significance of the KCA in Kalam, because the KCA, according to Craig himself, originates in Kalam. That's why he called it the Kalam cosmological argument. And I'm going to show that the way that it was used in Kalam was different from the way in which Craig uses it today. And Craig, his repositioning is actually, he's right on. It does need to be repositioned. But there's a couple of steps important steps that he misses. And then I'm going to talk about can something come from nothing, which is Craig's justification for his first premise in his formulation of the KCA. And I'm going to show you that this is a principle that the Mutakallimun would not have used. And it has implications on answering a number of atheist objections, such as the brute fact objection and the quantum physics objection, which I'm going to deal with at the end. So we'll start with Kalam. What is Kalam? So the science of Kalam, it originates in the Quran. And this is an important idea that I want to convey at the beginning, because people, they think that Kalam is Greek philosophy because it has a lot of Greek philosophical terms. I myself, when I first began my study of Kalam, I used to wonder, why are they talking about bodies and accidents, and why aren't they talking about atoms and molecules, as I studied in my science classes? But over time, I realized from the works of the Mutakallimun themselves that the reason why they are talking about bodies and accidents is because they are talking to someone who views the universe in a particular way. And what we need to do is we need to decouple what they're doing from their context. And when we decouple, then we see something that is very applicable to the context in which we live, and it no longer sounds like Greek philosophy. And so the origin of kalam, according to the mutakallimun, are the many verses in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he censures the idol worshippers of Mecca for following the ways of their ancestors. It's a common theme in the Quran that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, through the Quran, he brings reasons why the idol worshippers should abandon their idolatry. There's the famous debate between the Prophet Abraham and the idol worshippers who used to worship the sun and the stars and the moon. Many other instances of that as well. I'll share some other verses too. And so the Quran describes itself as making arguments, and it describes the idol worshippers of Mecca as refusing to follow the conclusions of rational arguments. And so I have here I'm going to quote a number of verses today. And the commentary that I'm going to quote most often is a commentary called Baydawi. Baydawi's commentary is the most influential commentary in the Muslim seminary tradition. It was studied all over. It still is studied all over.
What are Baydawi's dates? When did he live exactly?
He lived in the I think he died in the 700 Hijri. So right. That would be 700 years ago.
14th century, 15th century.
Yeah. So he explains here that what this verse is saying is it's saying that it's unlawful to do taqleed. Taqleed is to believe, to have religious belief merely because your ancestors used to have a particular religious belief. And so we need to come to our own conclusions of which religion it is that is true and follow that. And that's where the science of kalam, it comes from. So the scholars of kalam, they define the science of kalam as a science that enables you to prove the truth of religious beliefs with their conclusive proofs. So traditional kalam books are repositories of rational arguments according to the formal structure of logic that affirmatively prove the existence of God, the attributes of God, the existence of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that he's a genuine messenger from God. And then they seek to comprehensively survey all of the objections that someone could make to these arguments, and then they respond to them. And it's taken from these verses and many other verses in the Quran. This is a verse that I used to hear from my teacher very frequently. It's a very profound verse because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he tells the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, actually the Arabic here is incorrect. My mistake. It still has the old another verse of the Quran, but the Arabic of the verse over here should read قُلْ إِنْ كَانَ لِلرَّحْمَنِ وَلَدٌ فَأَنَا أَوَّلُ الْعَابِدِينَ. Say, if the All-Merciful had a child, then I would be the first to worship him. So God is commanding the Prophet Muhammad to tell the Christians that let's follow reason. Let's not stubbornly refuse to follow evidence. And in order to show that he was being fair and unbiased and rational, he was commanded to say that if you can show me, if you can prove to me that God has a son, that Jesus is the Son of God, I'll worship him too. And if I can show you that he wasn't, and that I'm a genuine messenger of God, then you should believe in one God and you should follow me. So there's many verses that appeal to rational evidence. قُلْ هَاتُوا بُرْهَانَكُمْ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. Bring your proof if indeed you be truthful. So the science of kalam, it originates in the Quran. And my favorite book of kalam is actually the tafsir of Fakhruddin al-Razi, who post Ghazali, and he has a book called At-Tafsir al-Kabir, which is the big tafsir. And he goes through all of the verses of the Quran. He didn't actually complete it. It was completed by another scholar a while later. But he goes through all of the verses in the Quran that he lived until he reached, and he brings out the rational arguments in them. So the science of Kalam, the science of Usul, it's full of applications. And what his tafsir shows is the Quranic origins of the arguments of the Quran. And these Quranic origins aren't immediately obvious if we read a book of Kalam proper, because they don't cite that many Quranic verses. They just use rational arguments. Because what they're doing is they are speaking to their opponents, and their opponents, if they don't believe in these verses, then you can't use these verses against them. So you have to use rational arguments. But they're taken from the verses in the Quran, and I'll show you a couple of examples in today's presentation. So Kalam, it began in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but it was Quranic, and it did not have the language of Greek philosophy, and it addressed the pure Arabian fitra, their natural human tendency, and it was a feature of the Quranic revelation that it was revealed to a people who were not a people of civilization, and so it could speak in a pure way, and it's miraculously beautiful language. Then, as time passed, the Mu'tazilites emerged. The Mu'tazilites were an early Islamic sect. There were other sects that came before them. The Khawarij came before them. The Shi'is came before them. But the Mu'tazilites, around the year, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they emerged and they grew, 4th century as well. They were scholars who were commissioned by the caliphs, particularly the Abbasid caliphs, to study Greek philosophy and defend Islam. So this is, it has the origins in the House of Wisdom and these other great libraries and intellectual projects that were initiated by the Abbasids, although it began earlier, but it reached its peak at that time. And they were very learned in Greek philosophy, and they debated the Christians who had inherited the philosophical traditions that came before them. And so they were debating with the Christians, and they did a good job in some areas, but they held certain characteristic theological beliefs that were considered incorrect by mainstream Islam, such as, for example, they denied the fact that God will be seen in the afterlife, which is something that is affirmed in many hadiths and in the Quran as well. They also said that they affirmed 3 groups of people. They affirmed 3 positions. They said that there was heaven, hell, and there was a middle ground, and they held a number of other positions. They also denied the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Kalam 1.0 was a response to the Mu'tazilites. And the Mu'tazilites, they made rational arguments. They used logic. And so the early Mutakallimin, they had to delve into logic in order to respond to the Mu'tazilites, in order to engage them. Then there's something which I call Kalam 2.0. And Kalam 1.0 and Kalam 2.0, this distinction between these 2 kinds of Kalam, it's made by the scholars of Kalam. There's an important scholar of Kalam. His name is Sa'duddin at-Taftazani. And he has a book called Sharh al-Aqaid al-Nasafiyya, which is the most important work ever to be written. It's still studied in seminaries all over the world. And he says that there's two kinds of kalam. There's the kalam of the early scholars, which was response to the Mu'tazilites, which I've called here Kalam 1.0. And then he said there's the kalam of the late scholars, Kalamul Mutaakhirin, which was an engagement with a group of people called the Falasifa. The Falasifa, sometimes it's mistranslated as the philosophers. These are the people who Ghazali, for example, responded to in his incoherence of the Falasifa, incoherence of the philosophers. The Falasifa refers to a group of Aristotelian philosophers, and most prominently Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi. And these two scholars, particularly Ibn Sina, they initiated a project to come to discover things using the human mind alone. And that's actually the definition of falsafa. Falsafa is an intellectual enterprise which seeks to discover through the human mind alone, unaided by revelation, as many things as are humanly possible. That's roughly how they define it.
And that's exactly the same, I think, in traditional Christian attitudes to philosophy. Christian philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, who sought to disclose, uncover, understand the world and everything through reason alone, but not through revelation. Didn't deny revelation, but
Right.
they didn't want to use that as a datum of their philosophy. So it's a very similar methodology, I think.
Yep. And Aquinas was, he took from Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina came earlier from him, earlier than him. So these are the Falasifa. And so these Falasifa, they were different from the Mu'tazilites because they had a system. They had a complete system. They had an epistemology. And so their arguments were a lot more complex. And they were also further removed from revelation than the Mu'tazilites. So Kalam 1.0, it's rational, but it's also scriptural. There's many verses of the Quran that are cited. Kalam 2.0, when it talks to the Falasifa, it's very rational, and it doesn't really cite Quranic verses because it's speaking to people who are trying to discover things through the mind alone. So the late Kalam tradition, it is Kalam 2.0. It's the rational arguments of the Quran in conversation with the Falasifa, with people like Ibn Sina. And this is what we have today. And so today when somebody studies Kalam, these are the books that they'll go to, and they'll look like Greek philosophy because they're talking to people who inherited Greek philosophy. They'll use their terms. But there's two things that kind of stand out. So our challenge today is not Greek philosophy. Aristotle is outdated. Nobody believes in it anymore. Modern science is founded on a rejection of Aristotle. A number of famous issues in physics, so Aristotle is gone. So the arguments of the mutakallimin of Kalam 2.0 that are against Aristotle or Aristotelianism, they don't strike the mark today because they're not talking to people today. They're talking to people who lived many centuries ago. And there's two things that I think are really important to keep in mind. The first is that when the late Kalam scholars, they engaged with the Falasifa, their biggest theological mistake was that the universe is eternal. They denied the fact that the universe began to exist. And they denied the fact that God had agency. They denied God's agency. They said God doesn't have knowledge, will, and power, but God is a necessary cause of an eternal universe. So there was a cause and effect relation. He couldn't choose to do things. So they denied the fact that the universe began to exist, but they did believe in a necessary being. So they believed, like Aristotle, Aristotle believed in a first cause, and Ibn Sina believed in a necessary being. So they believed in something that was like God, something that was immaterial. But when we talk to people today, then our opponents today are scientific materialists, scientific naturalism. This is so. I think that sometimes people they say, okay, we have to engage with modern issues, and so they go directly to the philosophers, Kant, Descartes, Hume. They're dead, but but still they'll long dead and old, but still they're important in the history of Western philosophy. They'll engage with them, or they'll engage with modern philosophers who talk about very topics that the average person doesn't understand or engage with. I think that the first opponents of Kalam today, or Islamic theology, shouldn't be people who very few people understand, but they should be the people who cause the greatest theological problems, doubts today, and these people are scientific materialists. And so the key issue is that the universe is the only thing that exists. The universe is a closed system. There's no need for God. Science explains everything. The miracles are impossible. Laws of nature are necessary. This is the foundational issue that Kalam needs to be realigned towards. And if we do this, then we discover that materialists today, they believe that the universe did begin to exist. So the falasifa believed that the universe didn't begin to exist. But because of the Big Bang, today, even scientific materialists, they'll believe that the universe did begin to exist. And the second difference is that whereas the falasifa, they believed in an immaterial being on which the universe depends, the materialists deny that. They deny anything beyond the physical universe. So for this reason, when we take Kalam 2.0 and we try to use it to solve the problems that people face today, it doesn't fit. So Kalam 3.0 is the Kalam that I think we need today, and it needs to speak to scientific naturalism. It needs to reference atoms and molecules and mass and energy and space-time and set theory and mathematical infinities. These are the issues that it needs to talk about. And it shouldn't be talking about bodies and accidents and hylomorphism and issues that aren't issues anymore. So Kalam 3.0, it is, I think there's three things that need to happen. The first thing that needs to happen is there needs to be a de-Hellenization. So the Kalam 2.0, it engaged with the natural philosophy of that was inherited from Aristotle. And all of that needs to go because we have a different natural philosophy today, which is based on a rejection of Aristotle. The second thing is that I think there needs to be a de-polemicization. What I mean by that is that when I look at Kalam studies today, what I find is that most people who study Kalam, they end up refuting other Muslims. And so what they'll do is it'll turn into Muslim of this sect debating Muslim with this sect and saying that you're an innovator or you're this or you're that. And I think that I don't think that's useful. I think that we live in a time when we need greater unity amongst Muslims. And also, I think we live in a time where we have a greater problem, because we have now, because of scientific materialism, we have people who are no longer Muslim. There's or people who think that religion is superstition, that religion is a myth, that God is a fairy tale. When we were talking to Ibn Sina, he said he was Muslim. The Mu'tazilites, they said they were Muslim. But the scientific materialists, they think that Islam is a myth. So it seems it seems wrong and counterproductive and I think that this is a sign that Kalam isn't doing what it's doing. When Muslims, they learn it in order to argue with one another. So I like Kalam a lot, but I don't like polemics. So when I teach Kalam 3.0, I don't do polemics. So my goal is, I want to prove the truth of Islam to somebody who's not a Muslim. And I think that needs to be our focus. And what that does is, I think it should open doors for everyone, whatever they might think of Kalam. Because there's some people who might disagree with some of the positions of the mutakallimin. And I think that's okay. I mean, everybody should use their mind and come to their own conclusions. But if we're reading William Lane Craig, who's not a Muslim, and benefiting from him, then we should also, by greater right, read Taftazani and the Mutakallimin who were Muslim and benefit from them, even if we disagree with them, even if somebody disagrees with them. So I think that there needs to be a de-Hellenization, de-polemicization, and a re-Quranification. I just invented a new word.
I never heard that word before.
That I think that if Kalam originated in Quranic verses, then those Quranic verses should form a context in which it is realigned. And the scholars of tafsir, they have a lot to say. I think that is often overlooked by students of Kalam. So this is what I mean by Kalam 3.0. So what I mean by Kalam 3.0 is a realignment of the classical Kalam tradition to address the problems of modern materialism, naturalism, and science.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the most important thing that needs to happen to revive Kalam today. So this is Kalam 3.0. And I'm going to illustrate it in application with William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument.
Fascinating idea. Fascinating.
So the KCA, before we look at Craig's formulation, I want to look at how it existed in the Kalam tradition. The Kalam cosmological argument had a particular use in Kalam 2.0. So in the Kalam tradition, there are two arguments for the existence of God. There's an argument called the argument from contingency, Dalilul Imkan, and there's another argument called the argument from beginning to exist, which is Dalilul Huduth. Huduth means beginning to exist. So in the Kalam tradition, there's no such thing as the argument from design. Design is used to argue for the attributes of God, not for the existence of God. There's no such thing as a moral argument. There's no such thing as an argument from consciousness. And I think that I guess that's a separate topic. Maybe we can have another discussion on that. I believe those arguments are flawed. But in the Kalam tradition, when we talk about the arguments for the existence of God, these are the two arguments. There's the argument from contingency, which is made by the falasifa and the mutakallimun. So mutakallimun are the Kalam scholars. The falasifa are people like Ibn Sina. Both of them, they argue from the fact that the universe is contingent, needy, dependent, to the fact that it depends on something that is independent. We call that a necessary being. I'm going to have a section in today's presentation where I'll unpack it a little bit more. So this is an argument from the contingency of things, which is the fact that they need something to make them how they are, to the existence of something that doesn't need anything. And that's the conclusion of this argument. The argument from the fact that, so this argument, the famous verse in the Quran, verily in the creation of the heavens and the earth and the alternation of the night and the day, Mufassirun like Baydawi and others, they would say that that these verses, they're saying that the contingency of all of these things proves the existence of a necessary being, and then the design in them proves that that necessary being has vast knowledge, vast power, and is able to do anything. And they'll also have an argument for oneness, but they'll refer specifically to contingency here and in many other verses. So that's the first argument. The second argument is the argument from the fact that the universe began to exist. And this argument was not made by the falasifa. It was only made by the mutakallimun. It was because the falasifa, they believed that the universe did not begin to exist. They believed that the universe was eternal. And the eternity of the universe went hand in hand with a denial of the agency of God. Yeah. So they said that God is a necessary cause of an eternal universe. He does not have a will. And the mutakallimun, in response to the falasifa, they said, actually the universe began to exist. And here's an argument. And they used the fact that the universe began to exist to prove that God has agency. Agency means that an agent is someone who chooses. He chooses to make things the way that they are, and he can make them differently. A necessary cause has no choice. The result of a necessary cause has to be the way that it is. It cannot be any other way. So if the universe did not begin to exist and then it began to exist, it actually also proves God's agency, because it means that God chose to make it exist. And it's not a necessary consequence of his existence. So the conclusion of the argument from beginning to exist, which is now known as the Kalam cosmological argument, is that there is a being that is beginningless, that did not begin to exist, and it's an agent, it's a creator. So this is like a high level of these two arguments. And the thing that I want us to take away is that the goal of the argument from beginning to exist, which is now known as the Kalam cosmological argument, the goal is to prove that the universe began to exist. When speaking to the falasifa who believe that the universe did not begin to exist. So Craig is not doing this, right? Because Craig is speaking to people who believe the universe did begin to exist. Craig we're going to see, is doing something different with this argument. So there's many verses in the Quran that talk about creation as evidence for a creator. Am khuliqu min ghayri shay'in am humul khaliqun, were they created out of nothing, or are they the creators? Am khalaqu as-samawati wal ard bal la yuqinun, or did they create the heavens and the earth? They have no certainty. So, and many other verses, Allah created the heavens and the earth. Verily, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, there's signs. So this argument also has Quranic origins. So that's the second thing. So so that we just did, which was the goal of the KCA in Kalam 2.0. The next thing is, what is the significance of William Lane Craig's KCA? So Craig's argument happened in light of the discovery of the Big Bang. Prior to the discovery of the Big Bang, everybody believed that the universe is static. Static means that it is unchanging. So when you look at the stars at night, they rise and set. So if you have time-lapse photography, then you'll see circles of that the stars make. And they all, and they, if you look in over the course of a year, it's all regular. There's some changes in their rising and setting locations, but then they come back at the end of the year, and it stays the same, and again and again and again and again and again and again. So you look at the universe, there's things that are moving, but it's the same. And because of this, people have always believed that the universe is static. Even Muslims who believe that the universe began to exist, even Christians who believe that the universe began to exist, they believe the universe is static, because if you look at the universe, it doesn't look like it's changing. So, it is. So there's a static universe, and it just keeps on going in the same way again and again and again and again and again and again. And this is like where the Aristotelian conception of it's just gone on forever, it's always been like this, and it will always be like this, comes from. In the 1900s, we discovered that the universe is not static, but it's changing, it's expanding, and it's expanding faster and faster. And that's really, really amazing, very profound. So it's getting bigger, expanding, and its expansion, it means that between every 2 points of space, there's new space being created in between it at every single instance. And you'd think that they used to have this theory that there's an expansion, and then it's slowing down, and then there's going to be a contraction, and there's going to be a big big crunch, and then a big bang again, and so you get this cyclical universe. But then they discovered that the universe is actually getting bigger, faster and faster and faster. And so it's accelerating. You say, where does the energy come from? Well, it's this thing called dark energy, which is you can't really see it. You can't see it, but it has to be there because there needs to be a reason for the acceleration of the universe. Of course, it can't be God, so there's some dark energy that you can't see. So there's this accelerating expansion. So because of the Big Bang, there is now a scientific consensus that the universe began to exist about 14 billion years ago. Because if you know how fast it's expanding, you can wind back the clock of time and determine when it all began. And it's about 14 billion years ago. So this raises the question, what made the universe exist? And this is where Craig's argument comes from, because scientific materialists, naturalists, what they would say is that the universe began to exist, but it doesn't have a cause for its existence. And that's why Craig, he said that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. So So this in Kalam 2.0, the focus of the Kalam argument was on proving that the universe began to exist. So traditional Kalam manuals, they begin with very long and complex philosophical arguments for the fact that the universe began to exist. That's the focus. And they said, obviously, if it began to exist, something made it exist. That was obvious. They didn't really go into that much detail in that area. But today, when this argument is employed, then the focus is on the first, which is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Because that's the premise that the materialist denies. The materialist doesn't deny that the universe began to exist. They all believe in it based on scientific evidence. The thing that they're denying is that it has a cause. So the significance of the Kalam cosmological argument as made by Craig is in the first premise, not in the second. He does have a number of original contributions in the second premise related to mathematics and infinity. But I won't be focusing on that in today's presentation. Maybe we can do another one afterwards. I'm going to be focusing on the first. Because even his wording, when he says everything that begins to exist has a cause, actually, when the mutakallimun in Kalam 2.0, when they formulate this argument, they don't use the word cause. They use another word. What they say is that they say that everything that begins to exist needs something to make it exist. Muhdith. And then they identify that being with God. But Craig, he uses the word cause. And so this is his Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God, and the goal is to prove that the universe has a cause. So his argument is the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. That's what it's known as in modern philosophy. And I just want to focus on a couple of words here. The first is cosmological. So he calls it the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. The reason why he calls it a cosmological argument is that in the Western philosophical tradition, there are many kinds of arguments for the existence of God. There's something called the ontological argument for the existence of God. There's something called the moral argument for the existence of God. There's something called the teleological argument for the existence of God. And there's something called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. So what Craig has done is he has taken a traditional Kalam argument and he has placed it in the context of modern philosophy. This is important to understand because when I showed in just a little while ago, I showed that from the perspective of the mutakallimun, there's only two arguments. So they don't have this idea of ontological, teleological, moral, cosmological. So the KCA, when it's called the cosmological argument, it is a placing of a traditional Kalam argument into the existing conversation of Western philosophy. And it's new. So because traditionally, the Aquinas, for example, didn't believe that you could rationally prove that the universe began to exist. That was something that he said had to be taken on faith. Maimonides, too, didn't believe that you could rationally prove that the universe began to exist, like Ibn Sina. And so historically, the people who have defended and argued philosophically for the fact that the universe began to exist with the greatest sophistication have been the mutakallimun. So Craig, he said that what did he do? He lived. He's living in a time when the Big Bang has been discovered, and people are saying that yes, the universe began to exist, but it doesn't prove the existence of God. He looks back at the various philosophers and he searches for someone who argued that the beginning of the universe does prove that God began to exist, and he found Ghazali. He found the mutakallimun. So he said, let me take it and let me bring what they said into Western philosophy because it doesn't exist. And he says that he says, I christened it the Kalam cosmological argument for God.
Literally Christianizing it, making it a Christian argument.
Yeah. So Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. So this is the history of the argument. It's the most widely, according to Quentin Smith, who is Craig's atheist interlocutor. They have many essays that they wrote in opposition to each other. It's published in a volume called the Kalam Cosmological Argument for the Existence of God. He said that it's the most widely published, debated argument for the existence of God in Western philosophy. And it's because of the Big Bang and the science around it. So that's the cosmological thing. The next thing that I want to focus on is the word God. Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. What Craig means by God is not the same as what the mutakallimun meant by God. And this comes out, I'm going to explain in a little while, that Craig, after he makes the argument for the existence of God, he says that there has to be a timeless being, that then and then he says that after the being creates the universe, it enters into time. It becomes one with the universe. And that's over here what I'm referring to as the Christianization of the argument, because the Christians believe that Jesus is God and that God became one with the universe. So it's a position that Craig, as a Christian, needs to uphold. But if the argument is made properly, as the scholars of Kalam made it, he can't do that. He can't do that because this same argument, it refutes the possibility of God being a contingent thing. And I'm going to show that. So when Craig is arguing that everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, what he means by cause is a supernatural cause. So supernatural, meaning something that is more powerful than the laws of nature, beyond science, supernatural. And supernatural, the Greek god Zeus is supernatural.
Right.
Right, because but he's not Allah. Allah, it doesn't, because he's contingent. He changes. Idols are supernatural. People who believe that they have supernatural powers. So the thing that Craig argues for is the existence of a being that is more powerful than the laws of nature. That being could be idol-like, or it could be a necessary being, and his conception of it is a being that is idol-like, human, right? So this is I have a book coming out, Kalam 3.0. It's the name of the institute. It's also a book I've
great cover. I like the cover actually. All those mathematical formulas and whatever. It looks very advanced.
Yeah, inshallah. I hope to finish it in Ramadan, and it'll come out. And I want to show some snippets of it. But basically, what I do in the book is I take all of I take the arguments of the Mutakallimun and I put them in formal logic. So it's everything has a this is A is B, all B is C, therefore A is C, and then it's broken down by premise and conclusion. And there's something called a modality. I'm gonna introduce you to the idea of modalities today, because it's important as part of this argument. A modality is whether something is necessarily true or possibly true or continuously true or actually true, the way in which a proposition is true. And then there's also, in the last column here, there's something called inferential, non-inferential. So what I do in the book is there's like 8 arguments, and they prove the truth of Islam, that God exists and that the Prophet Muhammad exists and that he's the messenger of the God whose existence we've just proven. And the arguments are, they're first made, and some of the premises, they are inferential, which means that they need to be proven by another argument. So I make the lower level argument whose conclusion is the premise of this argument, and we keep on going until we reach first principles. And the first principles, the Mutakallimun, it was an area that they talked about. So there's an epistemology section in the beginning as well. So I'm quite excited about this. Inshallah, it'll come out soon. But the reason why I showed this snippet here was that I wanted to show that in the traditional Kalam formulation of this argument, we don't say that everything that begins to exist has a cause, but we say that everything that begins to exist needs something to make it exist. And there is a difference between the two. So the final thing is that the Kalam cosmological for the existence of God, we're going to see that since Craig believes in a God who comes into time and changes and dies, the existence of what he means by existence is not the same as what the Muslims mean by existence, because we mean necessary existence, but he means a contingent existence. So that is the third thing. So what have we done so far? We have looked at this idea of taking Kalam as speaking to the Falasifa and aligning it with scientific naturalism. We looked at the KCA, its significance in traditional Kalam. We looked at the KCA, its significance for Craig. And now I want to look at how Kalam 3.0 begins. Kalam 3.0 is Kalam, traditional Kalam, realigned with against modern naturalism. So this is a change. Traditional Kalam argument, traditional Kalam manuals, they begin with proving that the universe began to exist. And the reason why they begin with proving that the universe began to exist is because they are speaking to the Falasifa who did not believe that the universe began to exist. But today, when we are speaking to a scientific materialist, if we start our books by making philosophical arguments for the fact that the universe began to exist, he's going to say, well, I already believe the universe began to exist. So next, and he thinks his argument is a lot clearer because there's scientific evidence. And so you're not talking to them. So if I'm talking to a scientific materialist, where do I need to begin? And the place where I need to begin is in refuting materialism. And I'm going to show that actually also refutes Christianity as well. So there are traditionally, there's two arguments for the existence of God. There's the argument from contingency and the argument from beginning to exist. The late Kalam manuals, they focus on the argument from beginning to exist. And for Kalam 3.0 to speak to the scientific materialist today, we need to focus first on the first argument. We need to focus on the argument from contingency. And the reason is that when we're speaking to materialists, they already believe the universe began to exist. So proving that the universe began to exist doesn't get us anywhere. But they believe the universe doesn't depend on anything. They think it's a closed system. The physical universe is everything that exists. So that's the place where we need to start. This is the argument from contingency. I call it the Quranic argument from contingency. Because the argument from contingency, it exists in the Western philosophical tradition as well. Aquinas made the argument from contingency. Leibniz made the argument from contingency as well. Many other philosophers have made the argument from contingency. But I think that the way that it's made in the Quran is the conclusion of the Quranic argument is very different from the conclusion of the argument as made by Thomas Aquinas, for example. Because the conclusion of the Quranic argument is the complete dependence of everything immediately upon a being that doesn't need anything. So there's a number of terms, right? So the first term is contingent, and the second term is necessary. So I want to take a moment to just explain those two terms. The term contingent, it means that something is contingent when it needs something else to make it the way that it is. So when I look at the sky, I see it's blue. I say, what made the sky blue? I have brown eyes, and you have blue eyes, or?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's brown, actually.
Oh, it's brown. Oh, okay. But maybe somebody else has blue eyes, and so I could have blue eyes. I could have brown eyes. Why are my eyes brown? What made my eyes brown? The wind is blowing. What made the wind blow? It's raining. Why is it raining? So when I look at the physical universe, I search for explanations of everything. And whenever I search for the explanation of something, it means that that thing depends on something else. And that is what it means for it to be contingent. This is important because the way that the argument from contingency is made by many people, including many Muslims, they make it incorrectly. They say that something is contingent if I can imagine it otherwise. But that's not actually what contingency means. Contingency is not it doesn't mean that I could imagine the universe being different. It's that I perceive that the universe as I see it now is dependent. So everything in the universe is dependent. And this is what it means for something to be contingent. The counterpart of a contingent thing is something that is necessary, a necessary being. A necessary being, in Arabic we say wajibul wujud. It means something that doesn't need anything. And it's needed by everything else. It doesn't need anything, and it's needed by everything else. So when I look at the things in the universe, the wind blows. What made it blow? The reason why I say what made it blow is because I perceive that it is contingent, it's dependent. Something that's necessary, I don't ask that question because I perceive that it doesn't need anything. It is how it is, and that's perfection, and it doesn't need anything to make it the way it is. Everything depends on it. It needs nothing. So the argument from contingency proves the existence of that being. This the way that I like to show it is by using the example of a long line of people, and this is taken from Mustafa Sabri Effendi, who was one of the last Shaykh al-Islams of the Ottoman Empire. He wrote one of the most important books of Kalam in the modern period. It's 4 volumes, Mawqif al-Ilmi wal-Aql, and it's a brilliant book. And he puts the contingency argument first. So what he says that the way to show that the things in the universe depend on something that doesn't need anything is to use the analogy of people in a line. He says that you have one person in a line who's leaning back, falling, and he's supported by the person behind him. And that person is falling onto the person behind him. And it continues like this. And he says that if all you had were leaning people, if every single person in the line was leaning, then they would all be on the ground. And this proves that dependent things cannot fulfill the dependency of other things. If all we have are contingent things in the universe, so I say, what made the wind blow? I see that the wind needs something to make it blow. And the weatherman says it's because of differences in air pressures. So I look at the differences in air pressures, and that's contingent too. So I say, well, what made the difference in air pressures? And they say that it's because of the tilt of the Earth's axis. So when it rotates around its axis, the heat of the sun is distributed at different densities across the surface of the Earth. Then we say, well, okay, then why is the Earth's axis tilted? And because that is also something that's contingent. And then we point towards something else in the universe. So there's a problem of whenever I explain something that is dependent in the universe using something else that is dependent, that doesn't answer the question. It opens up another question, and it opens up another question, and it opens up another question. So the more quote unquote answers I give, the more questions I have to answer. So when I have 2 leaning people, I'm not improving the problem, I'm actually making the problem worse. So this shows that to say that the universe is a closed system, that all you have are contingent things, it's false. That there has, in order for the line to be standing, there needs to be something that doesn't need anything. And that's the necessary being.
Can I just pause you there, if I may? Sorry to interrupt. I know you're just to clarify something, because you're talking about the contingent existence, why one thing relies for its existence on something else. But isn't there a sense that existence as such in our world is contingent, existence qua existence itself, without this kind of dynamic contingency, one thing behind another thing, behind another thing, behind another thing, the sequence of figures there on the screen there. But is there another sense that existence itself, as existence itself, is a contingent reality, that it speaks to something beyond it? See what I mean? It's a slightly different take.
Yeah, that's how Ibn Sina made the argument, and that's how actually the argument is normally made. And I have deliberately shifted it. Yes. Because the reason why I shifted it is because what I found was that when I'm talking to the average person, it's difficult for them to conceive of existence qua existence, because it's an abstract idea.
It's very most abstract idea that I've ever had. That is one can have, I think. It's it's a level of abstraction above the empirical or phenomenological
Yeah.
that is extremely exalted. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, and also what I found was that when I look at the Quran talks about the changing of the night and the day and the blowing of the winds and the sailing of the ships. So it talks about physical things in around us. And when we look at materialists, scientific materialists, this is what they talk about, and they say that this is all I need. So for all of these reasons, it's like practical judgment, I repositioned it, and it has a precedent. Other people did it too, but I think like this is the most effective way.
Right, but in terms of effectiveness, but rather than this being the best in terms of its intrinsic validity or ability, you're saying it's best for apologetic reasons or for dawah reasons, I suppose.
Okay. I think they both work. I think the coexistence works as well. So it's not a philosophical superiority,
no,
but it's practical.
Okay.
And I think that that when we look at some of the arguments in Kalam 2.0, sometimes I think anybody who's fair, when they read the works of the mutaakhirin, like Taftazani and others, Ghazali even, they'll see brilliance, but they'll also see some things that they'll say like, I don't know, like, so I think and I think that the reason why we say that is we see that is because by its nature, theology is a conversation. So when there's somebody who is having a conversation with somebody 700 years ago, then there are things that will be taken for granted and be understood 700 years ago, and the argument will be strong and effective, that when those things are taken away, when we look at those today, they're not as not as strong and effective. So there's a lot of there's like a judgment that goes in it as well. So I've actually all of these arguments I've worked with people, so I've trained teachers and who have worked with students. I've seen like hundreds of questions. I've seen what works. I've failed many times, and then I learned from my failures. And I'm actually very grateful to have the best way to fail is with a small group of people, who are with a small group of really intelligent people, and then you kind of benefit from that and learn. So that's where a lot of these things they come from.
It takes great humility to learn in that context what like you have done. Actually, I must say, it's extraordinary.
Yeah, I'm not sure about humility. It's just like I think it's just a recognition of the fact that your arguments get better when they're challenged, and so it's your own. Otherwise, you end up being the emperor without clothes. So the contingency argument, Allahu Samad, the meaning, Surah Al-Ikhlas, the As-Samad is the one who is needed by everybody, but who himself doesn't need anyone. There's many other verses like that as well. This is actually taken from my book, Kalam 3.0. It's a very dense book. It's not, and what I'm showing here is that I'll just read it. A necessary being is this idea of a necessary being has a strong precedent in our tradition, and the word Allah in a book of tafsir or a book of Arabic grammar or a book of any of the Islamic sciences, they'll say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, they'll begin with it, and they'll take the word Allah and they'll comment on it, and they'll explain what it means. And everyone in all of the sciences, they say it is the proper noun for the necessary being. So there's this idea that the key thing about God that differentiates him from everything else is his necessary existence, that he doesn't need anything and everything needs him. And we express that in our sujood. When we prostrate to God, that is, it's an expression of my complete neediness on the one who doesn't need anything. So that's what the word necessary being means. It's an Islamic concept, and there's many names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, many of the 99 names, like the real, the possessor of majesty. It's explained by scholars as his majesty is the necessity of existence, the self-sufficient one, qayyum, the many names. So the contingency argument, its conclusion is it's a central Islamic idea, and this argument, it refutes materialism. Because what is materialism? Materialism is the belief that the physical universe is everything that exists. So materialism is the belief that mass, energy, space, time, that's all. That's everything that exists. And what we've just done is we've proven that that's false. Because mass, energy, space, time, all of these things are contingent. They depend on something that doesn't need anything, that's not contingent. So this disproves materialism. And this is really significant because the materialist, what do? They say that this physical universe is everything that exists, and then they try to explain everything in terms of this. And they say that if you appeal to God, you are appealing to a fairy tale. And it's this defines their whole way of thinking. So this idea, it has to be refuted first. Otherwise, you can't talk to them. And yes. I'm going to illustrate that, because Craig doesn't do this, and that puts him into a problem. Did you want to say something, or?
No. I was just I chuckled because you were saying until you sort out this thing, you just can't talk to them, and I think that's very true, actually. It's also like I was asked a question yesterday by some people about how to talk to atheists who object to a certain Islamic whatever, who say it's wrong. Atheists might say, well, this is wrong or it's evil. And I'm saying, well, before we even look at this particular example that has been questioned by the atheists, we need to ask them, how come an atheist is using this language in the first place? The language of wrong and right and evil, even, because some prominent atheists do use this language. They're using religious language, the language of objective morality. Whence comes this language in their atheist worldview? So without even talking about the issue, so to speak, it's a similar move that you're making. We need to go back to the basics and say, well, what is your epistemology or metaphysics? How can you even use this language in the first place? Because you don't believe in any mind-independent morality, any objective ethics. So I was just reminding me of that.
Okay. So I like this. This is a very nice verse. So this verse, it says that مَا الْمَسِيحُ ابْنُ مَرْيَمَ إِلَّا رَسُولٌ قَدْ خَلَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ الرُّسُلُ وَأُمُّهُ صِدِّيقَةٌ. So this verse was revealed. It was speaking to Christians who believed in the divinity of Jesus, and also some of them, they believed in the divinity of Mary. She's the mother of God. So it's saying that the Messiah, son of Mary, is nothing more than a messenger. That's the most he is. He's not God. And there's many other messengers who we've sent before, who are also human beings. And his mother was a Siddiqa. She was a great believer in the messengers, a pious woman. So none of them are God. So the first part of this verse is saying they're not God. And then the end of it gives you the reason. And it says, كَانَ يَأْكُلَانِ الطَّعَامِ. They used to eat food. So what it's saying is that Jesus was not God because he was needy. Jesus was not God because he was dependent. And Baydawi and others, they bring that out. And it's also clearly in the verse. And dependency is contingency. So what this verse illustrates is that Jesus is needy, so he depends on someone who doesn't need anything. And so the argument from contingency, it disproves materialism. It also disproves the divinity of Jesus. And the Quran appeals to it over here. And so I just want to put these two things in our mind before we now turn to Craig. Can something come from nothing? So Craig, his argument, his formulation of the Kalam cosmological argument is everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And remember that the focus of Craig's KCA is the first premise. And that's good, because Muslims too today, when we bring the KCA, if we were to do it in Kalam 3.0, which I do, then the focus, it's the first premise that we need to see as key. Because when we're speaking to the scientific materialist, that's the thing that will be disputed. So everything that begins to exist has a cause. So this is denied. This is denied. It's denied by the materialist. Why is it denied by the materialist? Because he says the physical universe is everything that exists, and anything else is a fairy tale. So, and science can only explain in terms of physical things. So the physical things in the universe, when they need explanations, it's okay if we point to something that's within the physical universe because that's all that exists. But as a whole, it began to exist. Gosh, that's really puzzling. Of course, nothing beyond the physical universe exists because the physical universe is everything that exists. That's his assumption. So it has no cause. So that's their, that's kind of like how they, like a hand-waving way of explaining how they think. So everything that begins to exist has a cause. What is the proof of this? Why is it that everything that begins to exist has a cause? According to the Mutakallimun, if we go back to Ghazali, Taftazani, and Kalam 2.0, they will explain that the reason why something that begins to exist has a cause is because its existence is now contingent. This goes back to what you were saying, existence qua existence. But here it's a lot clearer because you are considering the universe non-existent and the universe existent. The universe non-existent and existence. No existence, existence. So what that means is that existence as an attribute is contingent. It's not necessary because the universe didn't exist. So what they say is that the reason why something that begins to exist needs something to make it exist is because we perceive that its existence is dependent. It's not intrinsic to it. So what this means is that the KCA actually it returns to the argument from contingency. Because the first premise, it appeals to contingency for justification. And there is a discussion amongst the scholars of Kalam about which one is primary. What is the basis for the universe's dependence on God? Is it its contingency, or is it the fact that it began to exist? And it's contingency. This is what they settle on. So it's more primary.
sorry, just I'm slightly disturbed by this language. It's not your fault. I'm not blaming you. But this language of nothing, the word nothing, the concept of nothing. What is nothing? Is nothing? Is it like an empty container, for example? So my container has no water in it, but of course it has dimensionality. It exists in a temporal dimension. It exists in time. It has dimensions. So it's not nothing. So okay. So it's not like the emptiness of a container in my kitchen, for example, to give a very pedestrian example. So to talk of things coming out or coming from nothing, I find it slightly disturbing because it suggests that there is a prior state out of which it comes. But I don't think that's what is intended, but that's what it sounds like. It can't come from it if it doesn't exist. So is it non-existence? Is nothing non-existence? But what does it mean to not exist anyway? Is that a positive state of ontology, of being in itself? So X is non-existent. So I'm slightly disturbed by this language. It seems to be a bit slippery. And I'm not in any way imputing any criticism of what you're saying at all, because this is not what you're not about this. But I'm just kind of reflecting on the coherence and the meaning of this concept nothing. Because it strikes me as a little bit ambiguous, if I may say that.
Yeah, it is, and you're absolutely right. So nothing is a privative concept, according to the Mutakallimin. It's just not a positive concept, like you say. It's like a negation.
Right.
It's not an affirmation. And I thought the same as you did, and so. What I think it is a slippery statement. It's not precise, and I think that what it means, like the proper way to understand it, is to say that from nothing contingent comes. Meaning what? Meaning not that if you forget about nothing. What it means is that no contingent thing is uncaused. So when somebody says that a contingent thing came from nothing, then what they mean is that the contingent thing is uncaused. It happened without a cause. So I think that is a clear statement to say that that from nothing contingent comes. In other words, no contingent thing is uncaused. But it has to be qualified to apply to contingent things. And when it's qualified to apply to contingent things, then it gives you a clarity, because otherwise this is what happens. This is the argument from contingency already explained. But what happens is that, so here's an objection by Mackey. He wrote a book called The Miracle of Theism.
Well, this miracle of theism, by the way, is meant to be humorous and ironic, because Mackey himself was an atheist. So when he talks about the miracle of theism, he's actually, this is a humorous, witty. He was British as well. I think he taught at Oxford. This is meant to be a witty statement. I just want to explain why it's called that.
Yeah, and it's a very good book. It's one of, actually, I think it's, to understand, it's one of the best philosophical defenses of atheism, and it's actually part of the Kalam 3.0 program. We do it in the third year.
We're re-engaging with some of the most classic texts then, if you're engaging with that book, that's for sure.
Yeah. So so he says in his objection to Craig, he says, there is a priori no good reason why a sheer origination of things not determined by anything should be unacceptable, whereas the existence of a God, lowercase, that's intent that he wrote it, with the power to create something out of nothing, B, is unacceptable. So this is his objection to Craig. He says, so what does this mean? This means that Craig, you are saying that the physical universe needs to be caused. And then you're saying that it's caused by God. And then you're saying that God does not need to be caused. So why is it that you're saying that the physical universe needs a cause, God does not need a cause? On what basis are you distinguishing between the two? Because if you say that the physical universe needs to be caused, you should also say that God needs to be caused. So that is his objection. And the lowercase God, I think it's very interesting he lowercases God, because I think that in his mind he is imagining God to be a contingent thing. And this is actually the somebody who's been a materialist for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, they have been conditioned into believing that everything they can imagine can be subjected to some kind of an experiment or test, and it can be manipulated, it can change, it's like this, it's like that. They have been trained to do that for decades. And it's but speaking, alhamdulillah, I'm grateful. I was born a Muslim, and I've been praying. And when I pray and I make sujood, I have, for many decades, I have been used to having a relationship with a being who is not contingent, who doesn't need anything, who cannot be the subject of a scientific experiment, who cannot be manipulated, who everything depends on, who needs to be worshipped, who this necessary being. So the greatest problem of the materialist is to break this. My teacher, Shaykh Hamza Karamali, he calls it satwatul hiss, which is the sensory being overpowered by sense perception. So from this perspective, like they see everything as contingent. And so even when you're talking to them about God, the thing that goes in their mind, it's a contingent thing. That's why he lowercases God. And if he believes that all gods are contingent, then he's right. Now, the key thing here is that Craig, even though he doesn't admit it, he's going to deny it, but he believes in a contingent God. And so to Craig, Mackey's objection applies. It hits the mark. So what is the response of the mutakallimun? The mutakallimun say that if you start with the argument from contingency and you eliminate materialism, you get rid of materialism first, and you show that the physical universe depends on a necessary being that doesn't need anything. Now you have rationally demonstrated the existence of a being that doesn't need anything to make it exist. You don't have this problem. Because so Ghazali and Taftazani will say that the cause of the universe did not begin to exist necessarily. I can prove the existence of something that is a necessary being that doesn't need anything to make it exist. But Craig, what does he say? Christians, when they argue for the existence of God, they focus on immateriality. They focus on proving the existence of an immaterial being, a non-physical being. They'll associate it with this idea of spirit as well. So William Craig, he says that the cause of the universe is uncaused and spaceless and timeless, but not necessarily. Meaning that it does not have to be uncaused and spaceless and timeless, because he says it enters into time. He says that this being whose existence I've just proven, after creating the universe, it enters into time and it begins to change with the changing of the universe. Whereas the mutakallimun, they would respond to Maki by saying that I've already shown that God is a being that doesn't need anything rationally, and so there is a reason why the universe needs to be caused, but God doesn't. And the reason is that the universe is contingent and God is necessary, and the contingent universe proves the existence of a necessary being. It's not an arbitrary statement. Craig, he says that an uncaused, immaterial God is not unintelligible, and we should keep the causal principle. So he says that, Maki, you are, when you say that the universe doesn't need anything to make it exist, you are rejecting the causal principle, and we should keep the causal principle. But he misses the point, because Maki is saying that if you're saying that the universe needs God, then you should also explain God. So if I'm rejecting the causal principle with respect to the universe, you're rejecting the causal principle with respect to God. So the only way out of this problem is to return the arguments to the argument from contingency, which Craig never does. He merely says that the universe began to exist. It needs a cause. The cause is spaceless, timeless, changeless. Then it comes into time, and it becomes, it starts to change with time. So is the cause of the universe uncaused? Ghazali says yes, because it exists necessarily. Craig says yes, because it is immaterial and initially changeless, although it later changes. And that leaves him open to Maki's objection, and because it means it's contingent. Because if the thing that created the universe later changes, it means it's contingent. It means it's lowercase God. It means that Maki's objection applies. So this is like the first illustration of how Craig's argument needs to be realigned, and which is that after proving that the universe began to exist and it needs a cause for its existence, the next thing that we need to do is to prove that the thing that caused the universe to exist is something that is a necessary being, that doesn't need anything. And the mutakallimun, that's the next thing that they do, and from that they prove its transcendence. They say it cannot have any physical characteristics. It's not subject. It's impossible for it to be subject to time. It's impossible for it to change. But Craig just puts that all aside, and he just focuses on the cause aspect, and then he Christianizes it. But that leaves him vulnerable to this objection, which the Kalam version responds to. But he can't use that, because if he did, it would disprove Christianity.
Thank you very much for that presentation. So when is the book coming out? When can we get our hands on it?
The book, inshallah, it'll be finished in Ramadan. It'll be out hopefully for Eid.
That's soon.
And
really?
It will coincide with the beginning of the Kalam 3.0 Institute, which is named after the book. Because what I want to, the book is basically an application of traditional Kalam to modern scientific and philosophical objections. And what I want to show in the Kalam 3.0 Institute is how I want to teach people how they can do it themselves by going to the classical manuals of Kalam and connecting them to modern theological issues. I want to teach people how to become mutakallimun.
So the institute itself is being launched just after Eid.
Just after Eid, yeah. But registrations are open now, yeah.
Oh, really? So, right. So you just go to your website, whyislamistrue.com/Kalam. Link is in the description below, as I say, for more information about the program and how people can register there. And registration is now open, and you can find out more about the institute at that website address. So click on the link or find it for yourself. That's the Kalam 3.0 Institute, which looks extremely an excellent enterprise, I must say. Absolutely fascinating. Well, thank you very much indeed, Shaykh Hamza Yusuf, for your time. Fascinating presentation. It's so good that people such as yourself, perhaps uniquely, are engaging with this topic at this level in a way that is lucid, accessible, intended to teach and outreach to a wider audience, rather than just be ivory tower, obscure, monographs in journals. No, you are reaching out, you're educating, you're trying to raise the bar in education, in Islamic education. So I think it's absolutely extraordinary enterprise you're undertaking, and I do commend you for it. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
Until next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.